Okay, I am a software engineer, in case you hadn't picked that up yet. And I like the problem-solving aspect of writing code, where somebody gives you a task they want you to complete, and you have to figure out a way to teach the computer to do that and to try to do it efficiently without bugs, without mistakes. And I still remember this logic puzzle from really early in my career, because when I finally figured out a good solution, it was that dopamine rush. It was sudden realization, an epiphany. I really enjoyed that. So I'm gonna try and convey this logic puzzle to you, so that you can see if you can figure it out too, and maybe you are already familiar with it and it won't be that big a deal. Maybe you were cleverer than I was, so it seems like a really easy thing to you, but to me it didn't start out easy, and it took me a bit to get there, and I'm happy about that result. Happy enough that I've remembered it for more than 20 years. For those who are not also programmers, there are a couple basic things you might need to at least conceptualize. You have logic questions, if and then. Like, so, if something is the case, then do this. And those are tests that you're applying to the information that you have. And then you have comparisons. Greater than and less than are going to be the most relevant ones in this case. And one step further, in this case, my puzzle to solve was about date ranges. You have two date ranges with a start and an end, and the question you're asking is, do those date ranges overlap? And you have 4 points of data, and you're asking a question about the relationship between those points of data. You could ask, for example, is the start date of the first value, or the first range, greater than the start date of the second range? Right? You can compare them and find out where they are related to each other, right? Those are the possible scenarios. And so the first time I tried to figure out this problem, actually, before I say that, might be a good point to pause the video, and if you have a notebook and a pen or something, you could see if you can figure out what questions you would ask to figure out if those date ranges overlap. Like, you can't just look at the diagram and say, yeah, of course those overlap. Right? The computer doesn't have the visual information. So how do you make the computer compare those values such that you can tell if the ranges overlap or not? And if you write down on a notebook you can just start writing what group of questions do you have to ask to find out if something overlaps or not, or if the date ranges overlap. Now, if you're like me and I didn't have any idea how to approach that problem, I started trying to define all the possible scenarios and then set up tests for each scenario. So, like, this is one scenario. Well, we'll start with, I only defined the overlapping scenarios. So it was like this, like this, like this, and like this, right? 4 relative situations where there is overlap. And then I designed tests for each of those scenarios, because the relationship between start and end dates are different. And so I thought, all right, I have to make the test account for each of those possible scenarios. But that's more complicated than it needs to be, because there are relationships between the starts and end dates that are the same in all the cases where there is overlap. So instead of trying to make 4 sets of tests of greater than, less than, and where each of those tests had multiple comparisons within them, if you look at the start date of the base value and the end date of the comparison value, if there's overlap, the start, like the, whoops, sorry, shouldn't be doing that while I'm driving, but the start date of the base value and the end date of the comparison value always have the same relationship when there's overlap. So in this case, the start date is always less than the end date. Start date of the base is always less than the end date of the comparison value. But there's one scenario where the start date can be less than the end date of the comparison value, but there's no overlap. And that's because you have to do the same thing with the end of the base date range and the comparison start. So basically, when there is overlap, those relationships will always be the same. The base start will always be less than the comparison end, and the comparison start will always be less than the base end. So really, for testing for overlap, you only need 2 tests. And you can do that out on your notebook and see that it works. But it's a vastly simpler solution than many iterative comparisons. Looking at, and just because it's the same level of complexity, there is another simple solution, but it tests for lack of overlap. And it's really just if the base start is greater than the comparison end, there's no overlap. And means your second test is if the base end is less than the comparison start. So basically you're just testing for whether or not they're completely outside each other's range. So that is just as simple as the first solution I explained to you. And it really just depends on which way you're approaching it. Are you really looking for overlap, or are you looking for lack of overlap? Right, now that I've explained that and feel proud of it, and if you've paused and given yourself time to fiddle with that, I think there might even be a larger lesson that can be learned from my experience, which is that when you have a problem that seems really complex, lots of factors, lots of pieces to consider, it may just be that you haven't figured out what the important relationships are between the factors. Where in this example of the date range overlap comparison, I started out trying to define all the possible scenarios and then creating a test for that scenario. I might have arrived at the problem sooner if I had recognized the relationship between the data points. Understood that it was about the start and end of the opposite ones. So what I'm saying is that in life, sometimes problems seem overwhelming, like there are too many things to deal with, too many things to account for. And maybe it could be done in a more manageable way if you can find a different point of view. Find a different way of looking at the problem. And I think sorry, I just thought of another concept in software development called rubber ducking. And if you think about what a rubber duck does in a bathtub, it just bobs there, essentially nodding its head, right? You can do that with a person, where you explain the problem to them and they just listen. All they do is nod their head like, yep, I'm hearing what you're saying. And they don't actually contribute anything, because as you're explaining it, you realize what the solution is to the problem. It helps you reframe it when you have to explain it to someone else. So, finding someone to explain to can help you just by forcing you to convey the information to another person. And I suspect that that's a large part of how therapy works, where explaining your problems to a person who is just going to be a good listener can help you change your perspective and see it a different way and deal with it better. And then one last thing is that sometimes problem is really bad, really difficult to deal with, really hard for you to get past, talking to someone about it and explaining it, maybe they have an idea too. That's super important in software development, where you just have to swallow your pride, accept that maybe this thing is too tough a challenge for you, and then ask someone. That's a problem I've also had a big problem with. When I'm hired for a job, or when I was as a younger developer, I figured it would be embarrassing and reduce people's opinion of me if I had to ask for help. What do they hire me for if I have to get help with the tougher problems? And so I didn't ask for help a lot. And it took me a while to figure out that asking for help is a really impressive sign of self-awareness. Being aware of when a problem is too difficult for you and when to ask for help, it indicates a great deal of intelligence to me, actually, because rather than wasting time and making things drag out and not solving the problem, you were aware enough that you needed help and you went for it. You did your Google searches, talked to your family, talked to your friends, talked to your therapist, and oops, where is this person going? Sorry. Anyway, this video actually got a lot further into psychology than I intended it to. I really was just excited to share my experience on dealing with that particular test of whether or not date ranges overlap. And it turned into something more. So, if you're a programmer who is looking for a solution to how to efficiently test for overlap on date ranges, it's about comparing start date of the base value to the end date of the comparison value. See, it's always greater no matter which form of overlap it is, and of course then the opposite, comparing the starts of the comparison to the end of the base. Two comparisons, I should say, one test. And if you're a person that was looking for how to approach seemingly complex problems, I hope that was helpful for you too. Yeah. Thanks for listening, and have a good rest of your day.